The morning sun cast long shadows across Ouagadougou as Captain Ibrahim Traoré prepared for what would become the most consequential speech of his life. In the small room behind the main auditorium of the Palais des Sports, he stood before a cracked mirror, adjusting the collar of his simple black shirt. No military decorations, no ceremonial regalia, just a man preparing to speak truth to power. Outside, the sound of gathering crowds grew louder by the hour. Vendors hawked water and roasted corn to the masses streaming toward the venue. Students from the University of Ouagadougou arrived in groups, their voices carrying chants of hope and change. Farmers who had traveled from distant villages clutched handwritten signs demanding justice for their stolen lands. Workers from the gold mines, their faces still bearing traces of dust from the depths, stood shoulder to shoulder with civil servants who had risked their jobs to attend. This was not just another political rally. This was a moment that had been building for months, perhaps years. Captain Traoré, the young military officer who had risen to prominence during Burkina Faso's most recent transition, had called this gathering to address the nation's future. But intelligence sources had been whispering for days that powerful interests wanted to ensure this speech never happened. The Palais des Sports had never seen such a crowd. Built to accommodate 5,000 people, it now held nearly 8,000 souls packed into every available space. The energy was electric, charged with the hopes and frustrations of a nation tired of empty promises and foreign exploitation. Marie Ouedraogo, a teacher from Ouagadougou, had traveled 4 hours by bus to be here. She held her young son's hand tightly as they found a spot near the middle of the crowd. "Mama, why are there so many people?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with wonder at the sea of faces around them. "Because today might be the day everything changes," she replied, her voice barely audible over the growing murmur of anticipation. Near the front, a group of university students had claimed territory early, their banners reading, "Our gold, our future," and the neo-colonial chains. Among them was Amadou Sankara, a 22-year-old studying economics whose grandfather had fought alongside Thomas Sankara decades earlier. The young man felt the weight of history on his shoulders, sensing that this moment might be as significant as the revolutionary days his grandfather often described. The press section buzzed with activity. Journalists from across Africa and beyond had descended on Ouagadougou, drawn by reports that Captain Traoré would make major announcements about Burkina Faso's mineral wealth and foreign military presence. Camera crews from France 24, BBC Africa, and Al Jazeera jostled for the best positions, while local reporters who had covered the captain's rise live tweeted updates to their growing audiences. But in the shadows, another kind of preparation was taking place. In a nondescript office building 3 kilometers from the Palais des Sports, a different kind of meeting was underway. The room was sterile, windowless, illuminated only by harsh fluorescent lights that cast everything in a cold, clinical glow. Around a metal table sat 6 men in expensive suits, their faces betraying no emotion as they spoke in measured tones about containing the situation. "The speech cannot proceed as planned," said the eldest among them, a man whose French accent carried the authority of decades in West African politics. "Our sources indicate Traoré intends to announce immediate nationalization of all mining operations and the expulsion of foreign military advisors. This cannot be allowed." The man to his right, younger but equally stern, consulted a tablet. "We have assets in position. 4 men, former special forces, currently employed by private security. They have official credentials that will pass casual inspection." "And the plan?" "Simple. create a disturbance that requires his immediate removal for security reasons. Once he's off that stage, we control the narrative. Emergency protocols, threats to public safety, the usual justifications. A third man, this one clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, shifted in his seat. The optics of this, if it goes wrong, if the people see through it, "The people see what we tell them to see," the eldest replied coldly. "That's how power works. That's how it has always worked." What they didn't anticipate was the character of the man they sought to silence, or the power of truth spoken in front of cameras that could broadcast that truth around the world in real time. At 2 p.m. sharp, Captain Ibrahim Traoré walked onto the stage. The roar that greeted him was deafening, a sound that seemed to rise from the very earth of Burkina Faso itself. He raised his hand and the crowd gradually quieted, though the energy remained palpable. He stood at the podium without ceremony, no entourage of advisors or security detail visible on stage. The simplicity was striking. Here was a leader who needed no pomp to command attention. His presence alone was magnetic, drawing every eye in the packed auditorium. "My brothers and sisters," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall without the need to shout. "My fellow citizens of this beautiful and proud nation we call home." The crowd leaned forward collectively, as if pulled by an invisible force. "We gather today not to celebrate me, but to celebrate something far more important, the awakening of our nation's conscience. For too long we have been told that poverty is our destiny, that our children must inherit the same struggles we inherited from our parents. We have been told that our vast wealth beneath the ground belongs to others, that our security depends on foreign soldiers, that our future must be mortgaged to foreign interests." Applause rippled through the crowd, but Traoré raised his hand again, asking for quiet. He had more to say. "But I stand before you today to declare that this narrative ends now. Today we reclaim our story. Today we write a new chapter in the history of Burkina Faso." It was then that the first of the four men entered through the side door. They moved with practiced precision, these four men who had no business being in that hall. Their security credentials were legitimate enough to pass the initial checkpoints, but their faces were unknown to the regular security staff. They wore the standard uniform of Presidential Protection Services, complete with earpieces and the subtle bulge of concealed weapons. The lead operative, a man in his mid-30s with the cold eyes of someone who had done this kind of work before, positioned himself near the left side of the stage. His colleagues spread out strategically, one near the right side of the stage, one at the back of the hall, and one remaining by the side entrance as backup. In the front rows, people began to notice. Mrs. Diabuga, a nurse who had seen enough violence in her work to recognize the signs, felt her stomach tighten as she watched the men position themselves. She whispered urgently to her neighbor, "Those men, they don't belong here." The whisper spread like wildfire through the crowd. Heads turned, fingers pointed discreetly, and a low murmur of unease began to build beneath the surface of Traoré's continuing speech. "Our gold mines," the captain was saying, "have extracted billions of dollars worth of wealth from our soil. Yet our children still lack schools. Our hospitals lack medicine. Our farmers lack the tools they need to feed our nation. Where has this wealth gone?" As if on cue, the lead operative touched his earpiece and nodded to his colleagues. The plan was in motion. But Captain Traoré had noticed them too. Years of military training had taught Ibrahim Traoré to be aware of his surroundings at all times. Even as he spoke passionately about his nation's future, part of his mind catalogued every detail of the room, the exits, the crowd's mood, the positions of his own security team. So when 4 unfamiliar men in official uniforms positioned themselves at strategic points around the hall, every alarm in his experienced mind began to sound. He paused mid-sentence, his eyes scanning the crowd until they locked onto the lead operative. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the 2 men stared at each other across the crowded hall. The captain's expression remained calm, but those who knew him well could see the steel entering his gaze. He said, "I see you." Suddenly, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a blade. The hall fell completely silent. 8,000 people held their breath as they realized that something unscripted was happening, something that would define not just this moment, but potentially the future of their nation. The lead operative's hand moved instinctively toward his belt, a gesture that sent a ripple of alarm through the front rows. Phones appeared as if by magic, their cameras already recording. In the press section, veteran journalists who had covered coups and crises across Africa recognized the signs and adjusted their cameras accordingly. "I know why you're here," Traoré continued, his voice steady and clear. "And I'm not surprised. This is what power does when it cannot win with truth. It tries to interrupt it." The tension in the hall was so thick it seemed to vibrate in the air. The lead operative, thrown off by the directness of Traoré's acknowledgement, hesitated. This wasn't how these operations usually went. Typically, they relied on confusion, on the target not understanding what was happening until it was too late. But Ibrahim Traoré understood perfectly. "You came here with threats," he said, his voice now carrying to every corner of the hall without the aid of amplification. "You came with uniforms you didn't earn the right to wear, with orders whispered in the dark by men who fear the light of truth." The crowd was beginning to understand what they were witnessing. Marie Ouedraogo pulled her son closer, her teacher's instincts telling her this was a moment that would be remembered in history books. Amadou Sankara felt his grandfather's revolutionary spirit stirring in his chest, and he began to record everything on his phone, knowing that the world needed to see this. "But I am not afraid of your whispers," Traoré continued. "I have heard them my whole life. I have seen men like you before. Men who hide behind power they didn't earn, who serve interests that are not those of the people of Burkina Faso." The operative's colleagues were looking to him for direction, but he seemed frozen by the unexpectedness of this public exposure. Their plan had depended on discretion, on being able to remove Traoré quietly under some pretext of security. But now they stood exposed in the harsh light of 8,000 witnesses and dozens of cameras. "I will not step down," Traoré declared, his voice rising for the first time. "I will not walk away, and if you try to take me now, in front of these people, in front of the entire nation, then understand what that means." "It means you're afraid," the captain continued, each word hitting like a hammer blow. "It means everything I have said is right. It means your fear of the truth is louder than my voice, and that terrifies you more than anything else." The operative finally found his voice, speaking into his concealed microphone, but his words were barely audible, and in the breathless silence of the hall, They seemed weak and ineffective. Traoré turned slightly, addressing the cameras directly now, speaking not just to the hall but to the millions who would see this footage in the hours and days to come. "You came to arrest me," he said. "Then do it. But know this, I am not the one on trial here. You are. You stand there with guns and badges you didn't earn. I stand here with nothing but truth and the people behind me." As if responding to some invisible signal, the crowd began to stand. It started in the front rows and spread backward like a wave, until all 8,000 people were on their feet. They didn't chant or shout, they simply stood, their presence a silent but overwhelming declaration of solidarity. "And that," Traoré said, gesturing to the standing crowd, "is more powerful than anything you carry." The effect was immediate and dramatic. The 4 operatives, who had entered the hall with confidence and purpose, now found themselves surrounded by 8,000 pairs of eyes, 8,000 witnesses to their actions. What had been planned as a discreet operation was now the most public event in recent Burkinabe history. Mrs. Diabuga, the nurse who had first noticed the intruders, felt tears streaming down her face. She had lived through multiple coups and political upheavals, had seen too many promising leaders silenced or corrupted. But this felt different. This felt like a moment when the people themselves became the guardians of their own democracy. Young Amadou Sankara was live streaming to his social media accounts, and the viewer count was climbing rapidly. Comments poured in from across Africa and around the world. "Stand strong, Burkina Faso. The whole world is watching. This is what courage looks like." In the press section, seasoned journalists were typing furiously, trying to capture in words what was essentially indescribable. The moment when a single man's courage transformed a crowd into a movement. But perhaps the most significant transformation was happening in the operatives themselves. The lead operative, whose name was Marcus Cohn, though he had not used his real name in years, felt something he had not experienced in his decade of covert operations: shame. Standing there under the gaze of thousands, being filmed by dozens of cameras, he suddenly saw himself as these people saw him, not as a protector or enforcer of order, but as an instrument of oppression. His colleague near the right side of the stage, a younger man named Paul Ouattara, was visibly sweating despite the air conditioning. He had joined this line of work for the money and the adventure, telling himself that he was maintaining stability in a chaotic region. But looking out at the faces in the crowd, men and women and children who believed they were witnessing their nation's liberation, he began to question everything he had told himself about his work. Captain Traoré seemed to sense their wavering resolve. "Try to stop me," he said, his voice carrying absolute conviction, "and you will answer, not just to this room, but to every mother, every soldier, every child in Burkina Faso who knows what justice smells like." The phrase hit the crowd like electricity. Every child who knows what justice smells like. It was pure poetry, and it captured something essential about the Burkinabe spirit that had been suppressed for too long. "You thought this would be quick, clean, quiet," Traoré continued. "But you just made it impossible to look away, and now the whole world is watching." It was Paul Ouattara who broke first. The young operative, overwhelmed by the weight of 8,000 stares and the live streaming of his actions to a global audience, slowly lowered his hand from his weapon and stepped backward. The movement was subtle, but in the charged atmosphere of the hall, it might as well have been a thunderclap. Marcus Cohn saw his colleagues retreat and felt his own resolve crumbling. This wasn't what he had signed up for. Political operations were supposed to happen in the shadows, away from the judgment of ordinary people. But here, under the harsh lights of the Palace de Sports, there were no shadows to hide in. A woman in the crowd, Marie Odreogo, the teacher from Kudugu, suddenly shouted, "We are with you!" Her voice, clear and strong, cut through the tension like a sword. Another voice joined hers, "Touch him, and we rise!" Soon voices throughout the hall were calling out their support, not chanting in unison, but individual voices declaring their personal commitment to stand with their leader. The effect was far more powerful than any organized demonstration could have been. Captain Traoré looked out at them, and for the first time since the operatives had entered, he smiled slightly. "This is not just about me," he said. "This is about every man and woman who ever raised their voice and was told to shut up, who built this country while others tried to sell it, who believed in the promise of independence and refused to see it betrayed by those who would trade our sovereignty for personal gain." The second operative, stationed at the back of the hall, was the next to break. Surrounded by hundreds of people who had turned to look at him, their phones recording his every move, he felt exposed and vulnerable in a way that his training had never prepared him for. Slowly he began to move toward the exit, trying to blend into the crowd but knowing that everyone was watching. Marcus Cohn, the team leader, realized that his operation was not just failing, it was becoming a public relations disaster of epic proportions. Every second they remained in the hall, more footage was being recorded and uploaded to social media. Within hours, their faces would be known across Africa and beyond. He touched his earpiece one final time, speaking in a voice so low that only his handler could hear. Operation compromised, withdrawing. But Captain Traoré wasn't finished with them yet. "Let me remind you all," he said, his voice now filled with the righteous anger of a man who had seen his nation's dignity trampled for too long. "Burkina Faso does not kneel to pressure. It does not sell its future to cowards, and it does not arrest truth." The word cowards hit the remaining operatives like a physical blow. These were men who had built their identities around being strong, being fearless, being the sharp edge of power. To be called cowards by their intended target in front of thousands of witnesses was perhaps the most devastating thing that could happen to them. As the last two operatives hesitated, caught between their orders and the overwhelming moral pressure of the moment, Captain Traoré delivered what would become the most quoted lines of his speech. "This stage was meant to become a prison today," he said, his words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "Instead, it has become proof. Proof that you cannot stop a movement when the people are its shield. Proof that truth spoken in the light is stronger than all the whispers in the dark." The crowd erupted, but not in chaos, in thunderous, sustained applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The sound was overwhelming, a physical force that seemed to push the remaining operatives towards the exits. Marcus Cohn, his mission in ruins and his reputation destroyed, slowly backed towards the side door through which he had entered. His remaining colleague followed, both men moving like sleepwalkers through a nightmare that had somehow become reality. As they reached the door, Cohn turned back one final time to look at the man they had been sent to silence. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood at the podium, not smiling in triumph, but simply watching them go with the steady gaze of a man who had always known this moment would come. The door closed behind the operatives with a soft click that somehow managed to be audible even over the continuing applause. They were gone, their mission failed, their anonymity destroyed, their careers probably ended. But Captain Traoré was not done speaking. "My friends," he said, and the crowd gradually quieted to hear him. "What you have just witnessed is the most important thing that will happen in this hall today. You have seen that when the people stand together, when truth is spoken without fear, when light is shed on the actions of those who prefer darkness, power retreats." He paused, looking out over the sea of faces, each one representing a life, a family, a hope for the future. "This is how we take back our country, not with violence, not with hatred, but with truth and unity and the courage to stand up when it matters most." The applause that followed was different from before, deeper, more sustained, carrying within it the sound of a nation that had rediscovered its voice. In the hours that followed, the footage of Captain Traoré's confrontation with the operatives spread across the internet like wildfire. Within 6 hours, videos of the event had been viewed over 1 million times. Within 12 hours, that number had doubled. News outlets across Africa picked up the story, with many describing it as the most powerful moment of public resistance in modern African politics. The hashtag Burkina Stands began trending worldwide, accompanied by clips of the captain's words and images of the crowd's solidarity. From Dakar to Nairobi, from Lagos to Cairo, people shared the videos with commentary in dozens of languages. This is what leadership looks like. When the people stand together, tyranny cannot prevail. The whole world is indeed watching. But perhaps more importantly, the message resonated within Burkina Faso itself. In villages across the country, people gathered around radios and phones to listen and watch the speech. Many had tears in their eyes as they heard their captain refuse to be silenced, as they saw their fellow citizens stand up in defense of truth. By evening, official statements began to emerge from various government offices. The language was carefully crafted, designed to minimize and deflect. The individuals involved in today's incident were not authorized representatives of any official security service. The situation at the Palais de Sports was resolved without incident through the calm and professional handling of all parties involved. The government of Burkina Faso remains committed to the peaceful expression of political views and the protection of all citizens' rights. But the people had seen what they had seen. They had watched the fear in the operatives' eyes, had witnessed the moment when courage triumphed over coercion. No official statement could erase that reality. International observers were less diplomatic in their assessments. A spokesman for the African Union called the attempted disruption deeply concerning and praised Captain Traoré's commitment to democratic principles under pressure. The European Union issued a statement supporting the right of the Burkinabe people to hear from their leaders without intimidation. Dr. Aminata Diallo, a political scientist at the University of Ouagadougou, would later write that this moment represented a fundamental shift in African politics. For too long, she observed, our leaders have been silenced through fear, intimidation, and violence. What Captain Traoré demonstrated is that transparency, the simple act of calling out oppression in public, can be more powerful than any weapon. The incident became a case study in political science courses across the continent. Students analyzed the power dynamics, the role of social media in modern resistance movements, and the way that individual courage can catalyze collective action. But for the people who were there, who stood in that hall and witnessed history being made, the academic analysis was secondary to the emotional reality of the moment. They had seen their leader tested under the most extreme pressure and had watched him refuse to bend. In the days that followed, Captain Traoré would face increasing pressure from various quarters. Some of his advisors urged him to moderate his rhetoric, to find ways to work within existing power structures rather than challenging them so directly. "Sir," one of them said during a private meeting, "what happened at the Palais was inspiring, but it also made you enemies. powerful enemies. We need to think about your security, about the safety of your family." The captain listened to these concerns with the same calm attention he had shown during the confrontation itself. But his response was unwavering. If we moderate our truth to accommodate their lies, we become complicit in our own oppression. The people didn't stand with me in that hall because I was safe. They stood with me because I was honest. I won't betray that trust now. In the weeks following the speech, something remarkable began to happen across Burkina Faso. People who had never been politically active began organizing themselves. Teachers formed committees to discuss education reform. Farmers started cooperatives to reduce their dependence on foreign-controlled supply chains. Students launched campaigns to promote transparency in government spending. The phrase, "truth and unity, and the courage to stand up when it matters most," became a rallying cry that appeared on banners, T-shirts, and social media profiles. But more importantly, it became a principle that ordinary citizens began to apply in their daily lives. Marie Ouedraogo, the teacher who had attended the speech with her son, started a parent-teacher organization that demanded better funding for public schools. "If Captain Traoré can face down armed men in front of the whole nation," she told her colleagues, "we can certainly face down bureaucrats who want to deny our children a proper education." Young Amadou Sankara used the footage he had recorded to create a documentary about the event, which was screened in schools and community centers across the country. The film became a tool for civic education, helping people understand their rights and the importance of active citizenship. Years later, historians would mark this speech as a turning point in Burkina Faso's modern development. The policies that Captain Traoré announced that day, the nationalization of mining operations, the renegotiation of foreign military agreements, the massive investment in education and healthcare would transform the country's trajectory. But perhaps more importantly, the way he handled the attempted disruption created a new template for political courage. Across Africa and beyond, leaders facing similar pressures would remember the image of a man standing alone at a podium, refusing to be silenced, turning the light of truth on those who preferred to operate in darkness. The 4 operatives who had entered the hall that day disappeared from public view. Some reports suggested they had fled the country, others that they had been quietly reassigned to desk jobs far from the centers of power. But their failure had consequences beyond their individual careers. It demonstrated to anyone considering similar actions that the age of quiet coups and discreet removals was ending. In the end, the most powerful weapon Captain Ibrahim Traoré wielded that day was not rhetoric or charisma, though he possessed both in abundance. It was transparency. The simple but revolutionary act of naming what was happening as it happened, of refusing to allow oppression to hide behind official language and bureaucratic euphemisms. "You think you can walk in here and stop me?" he had asked, and in doing so, he had answered his own question. They couldn't stop him, because truth spoken in the light, supported by the courage of ordinary people, is unstoppable. The hall fell silent after his final words, but the silence was not empty. It was full of possibility, pregnant with the promise of change. As the crowd began to file out, each person carried with them not just the memory of what they had witnessed, but the knowledge that they had been part of something historic. The speech that was meant to be silenced became the speech that could never be forgotten. And in a small, landlocked nation in West Africa, the people had learned that their voices, when raised together in defense of truth, were louder than all the whispers of power combined. This was not just Captain Ibrahim Traoré's moment. It belonged to every person who stood that day, to every camera that recorded the truth, to every voice that refused to be silenced. It was the moment Burkina Faso remembered what freedom sounded like and decided never to forget again.